The Warsaw Uprising has been called one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. And in this special two-part episode of Heart of Poland, you're going to discover everything you need to know about the Warsaw Uprising with guide at the Warsaw Rising Museum, Aleksandra Duda. So Ola, welcome to the show. It's a particular privilege to sit down here with you because you spend pretty much every day of your working life talking about the Warsaw Uprising to visitors who come to this spectacular museum in Warsaw. Tell us, why did the Rising take place?
Let me start with the citation. Pericles said that freedom is the sure possession only for those who have courage to defend it. World War II started for Polish people in 1939. We were extremely suffering from the very beginning of World War II, attacks from both sides by Germans and Soviets. And the German and Soviet occupation were really difficult for us because there were mass executions, roundups. People were deported to concentration camps. And after these 5 years of very terrible time, we decided to stand up openly against Germans here during the Warsaw Rising.
So maybe let's go a little bit more into what you mean by these sort of roundups and shootings. If I'm a typical Polish person during the Second World War, I'm risking my life every time I leave my house because I could get arrested and deported.
Exactly.
Is it different in other countries? I mean, is this the case also in I don't know, Holland or France?
The character of occupation in Poland was totally different because Germans came here with a ready-made list of people to be executed. For example, 60,000 people who were educated, who had university degrees, who were priests, who were doctors, engineers. They were to be eliminated in the first place, yes. And in fact, we need to underline that both occupants, Germans and Soviets had the same idea of eradicating Polish culture, Polish people, because they wanted to take over our territory.
So you've got the Polish Home Army, they're the main resistance. They're in Warsaw, and obviously they've seen what's happened in 1943 with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which is essentially this hopeless battle against the Germans that surprisingly goes on for a couple of weeks, quite a long time. Did they not look at that and say, hey, we don't have the weaponry to fight back against what the Germans can bring in this battle? How did the Ghetto Uprising have any impact on the decision to make the Warsaw Uprising happen?
Well, we need to state that we are preparing for the national uprising all through the years of World War II because the Polish resistance was very, very strong. We had 400 underground soldiers when we saw that the Soviets are just on the outskirts of Warsaw, at the gates of our beloved city, we wanted to liberate Warsaw first, yes. We need to remember that the situation was very, very tough because we had two governments operating, the legitimate government operating in London. We wanted this government to be back in Poland, but Stalin imposed his government onto our territory. Strictly speaking, communist government on July the 22nd. That's why we needed to do something about this situation.
So the Polish commanders are trying to use this uprising not just to fight against their enemy, but also for political purposes.
Yeah, exactly. We need to remember that the Warsaw Rising militarily was against Germans. We want to expel them from our city, but politically it was against Soviets who wanted to impose their control of our country.
I mean, that is fascinating, isn't it? Because you've got the other famous uprising, the Paris, quite violent, but nowhere like the scale of violence that you see in Warsaw, which has a sort of French political connotation, but isn't involved with Soviet Russia. Tell me, who's fighting in the Warsaw Uprising? I mentioned the Home Army. They're the only unit, and who are they allied with? Are they communist or are they with this Polish government?
Well, they were faithful to the Polish government in exile in London, and there are 35,000 insurgents against 20,000 Germans. So we need to remember that 65% of those young boys and girls under 25. So these were young people. They did not want to die at the barricades. They wanted to live, they wanted to have fun. But it's fascinating that they did not hesitate. Should I spare my life at the barricade? They went fighting. They were really dedicated to the cause, yes. And this question, being dedicated to the cause, is crucial when we analyze the idea of the Warsaw Rising.
It's kind of extraordinary when you think about it. These people, what are they armed with at this stage? Has everybody got a rifle, or is there sort of queue for one rifle for 10 people? What does it look like?
Well, the situation was very desperate because only 1/10 of soldiers had anything to fight with, yes. And Germans were armed to their teeth. They had everything we dreamt of: 600mm mortar, heavy artillery, Stuka dive bombers, self-propelled mines known as Goliaths, yes. And we had only handmade grenades and handmade flamethrowers. So this was very difficult for us. We needed to retrieve guns from Germans, or we counted on the airdrops that were dropped by the Allies here.
Why did the commanders pick the 1st of August at 5 o'clock as Godzinowy W hour?
Well, we need to remember that Soviets were just on the outskirts of Warsaw, yes. We remember that they wanted to take over Poland, and we knew that the advance through the eastern parts of our country had nothing to do with the liberation, yes. The pillage and maltreatment was the standard procedure, yes. Women were raped, children were being shot, and it's crazy, but that's the way it looked like. It had nothing to do with liberation that took place in Western Europe, where Americans and British and Canadians liberated France, Belgium, Holland, and they went back home right after the end of the war. Soviets liberated Poland, rid Berlin, and stayed here for many, many years. In fact, the last Russian soldier left Poland in 1993, so 4 years after the restoration of independence.
Let's talk about the opening period of the uprising. How successful were the Polish resistance, the Polish Home Army, in taking over Warsaw?
We managed to take over 60% of the city, but the problem was that Hitler ordered all men, women and children to be killed on the spot. He invited SS units that were composed of outlaws and criminals who started slaughtering civilians. What happened in Wola district is unthinkable. 50,000 people got killed just within 3 days. That's why after the war we found here 12 tons of human ashes. So imagine, wherever you go in Warsaw, you come across those plaques saying 500 people burnt alive, 300 shot. So it's really depressing, yes, but it gives you the idea that every single stone here had soaked with the best Polish blood.
So you've got these Polish resistance units, and they've taken over 60% of the city, but there's still something like a million civilians, or several hundred thousand civilians who don't know this uprising is taking place because it's so secret. So they're kind of trapped in these enclaves, in these regions of the city where there aren't enough Polish resistance units to defend them. And now you're saying that the Hitler and the SS, their order is to destroy the city from the face of the earth.
Yeah, exactly. Torn it
do we
to
know
foundations.
That? Do we know that, or is that a kind of, is that a written order that we have?
Yeah. Generally, it was known to the troops. They would, for example, report to the commanders. SS units would report to Wehrmacht generals, what shall we do? We have too many detained people and not enough ammunition. What shall we do?
To kill them.
Yeah. That's why, for example, very often they would use just butts to kill people.
I mean, obviously this is a time of great horror and great suffering. The Holocaust, mass executions further east in Belarus and other places. Is what's happening in Warsaw during this uprising, this genocide, is it quite unique because it's taking place in an urban setting? I mean, as far as I know, there's no kind of mass execution of civilians on that kind of scale in any other city in the whole of Europe.
Yeah, exactly. It happened for the first time on such a scale, yes.
And this is directly an order from Hitler saying, wipe this city off the the face of the earth. What about from a military perspective? How much of the city are the Poles able to capture, and how much do they dominate that in the first opening weeks of the uprising?
So they took over, as I said, 60% of the city. So district after district, we tried to take control of what was here. But the problem was that every district was encircled by Germans, yes, and when there was no hope left, insurgents would descend into the sewers and march to other districts of Warsaw to have possibility to fight Germans in other places.
So we're talking about the sewers. So the fighting is from a distance, or it's hand to hand. What does the combat look like?
All kinds of urban battle, I'd say here. It was very, very difficult, as I said, and very ferocious. Yeah, some buildings were attacked many, many times and went to both sides 11 times. So imagine how difficult it was. But we were really motivated to be victorious, because this was the last chance for freedom for us. Yes, and in fact we were doomed, because this whole event of the Warsaw Rising had no sense at all from the geopolitical point of view, because our fate was already settled during the conference in Tehran by the Allies.
So this is the idea that Stalin knows he's going to take over this country, and essentially there will be no legitimate Polish government, no democratic elected Polish government. Stalin will pick the government he wants, and the ruling party that he wants as well. And this is all basically decided before this launch takes place. Looking back now, what is your personal feeling about the decision to take this uprising? How do you feel about it personally?
Well, generally we have lots of discussions among historians still whether it was worth fighting for, losing so much. And opponents of the Warsaw Rising always drag this argument that it had no sense at all, because so many beautiful boys and girls got killed and there was no one to build New Poland. And I always respond that when you take the numbers, during the Warsaw Rising, 18,000 of those beautiful generation members got killed. But in between 1944 and 1956, during the harshest period of Stalinist era, 50,000 Poles got killed. There were 4,000 death sentences issued. There were people taken to prisons and murdered. And these were not criminals. These were not bandits, rapists. These were our soldiers who fought Germans in 1939, who fought along World War II to expel Germans from the territory. But they are treated as enemies of the state for the Stalinists.
So even the uprising, as terrible as it was, still is incomparable to the scale of this terror.
And what followed later. So whenever you look at the topic of the Warsaw Rising, you need to talk about Germans, but you need to bring in this Stalinist perspective.
I can't think of a better moment to finish episode 1. This is a 2-part series on everything you need to know about the Warsaw Uprising. And in the next episode, issued next week, you're going to find out how the Warsaw Rising continued, how the soldiers managed to keep on fighting, and ultimately, after 63 extraordinary days, how it ends. I'll see you next week for the next episode.